Hi, this is Jeff Shapiro, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 13th issue of the New York Times and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Iran prepared for war, but ready to negotiate, Foreign Minister says. The comments came after President Trump said that he was looking at some very strong options to curb the Iranian authorities' harsh repression of anti-government protests. Iran said Monday that it was prepared for conflict but also ready to negotiate after President Trump warned that the United States might intervene to stop an increasingly deadly government crackdown on opposition protests. We're not looking for war, but we are prepared for war, even more prepared than the previous war, Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, told a conference of foreign ambassadors in the capital, Tehran, in remarks broadcast by state television. He appeared to be referring to the 12-day war with Israel this past June, which the United States joined to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. We're also ready for negotiations, but negotiations that are fair, with equal rights and mutual respect, he added. Hours later, Iranian state media showed images of large crowds in several cities rallying in support of the government and funeral processions for security personnel killed in the unrest that began 2 weeks ago. The great nation of Iran demonstrated itself, its determination, and its identity to its enemies, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, said in a statement carried by state media. He called the pro-government allies a warning to American politicians to stop their deception. It was not clear what the situation was Monday night on the streets. Protests often pick up at night, and information on them is slow to trickle out. As anti-government demonstrations have intensified recently, senior Iranian officials have laid the blame on the United States and Israel, saying that they are backing the protesters. Iran's foreign ministry summoned the British, German, Italian, and French ambassadors on Monday, according to the semi-official news agency Tasnim. The ambassadors were shown footage of rioters' violence. The Tasnim report said, adding that Tehran had called for the withdrawal of official statements supporting the protesters. The signaling on Monday from Iranian authorities, defiant but also apparently open to diplomacy, came after Mr. Trump threatened on Sunday that he might act militarily to curb the government's repression of widespread demonstrations. Iran has roiled in recent weeks by protests that began over economic hardship and then snowballed into a serious challenge to the country's authoritarian clerical rulers. As of Sunday, human rights monitors said that nearly 200 people had been killed since the protests began in late December. Other rights groups put the death toll much higher. Assessing the casualty tolls and size of protests has been challenging because the Iranian authorities have imposed such severe limits on how information is shared, both internally and outside the country, including shuttering the internet. Mr. Trump was briefed in recent days on new options for military strikes in Iran, but had not made a final decision, according to multiple U.S. officials familiar with the matter. We're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it, and we're looking at some very strong options, Mr. Trump told reporters on Air Force One on Sunday without providing details. He added, I'm getting an hourly report, and we're going to make a determination. Mr. Trump later said that leaders of Iran had called him on Saturday and that they wanted to negotiate. He did not give further details on that matter. Iran said on Monday that communication channels were open between Mr. Araghchi and Steve Witkoff, Mr. Trump's Middle East envoy. Iran has never left the negotiating table, but it will not engage in one-sided negotiations, Ismail Bagahe, a foreign ministry spokesman, told a news conference on Monday. Another sign of diplomatic activity came from Oman, which has at times served as an intermediary between Washington and Tehran. On Saturday, the Omani foreign minister, Badr al-Busadi, said that after meeting with Iranian officials in Tehran that he had a productive day that included discussions of pressing regional and global developments. Mr. al-Busadi did not provide details. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman said on Monday that the exchange included issues that we always discuss with Oman, but he did not elaborate. It remains unclear what negotiations between Iran and the United States might entail. Talks on Iran's nuclear program have stalled in recent months. Farzan Sabad, an analyst on Iran and Middle East politics at the Geneva Graduate Institute in Switzerland, said that the communications blackout in Iran made it difficult to gauge the current thinking of Iranian authorities. But Iran's government has often used public statements of outreach to boost the markets or the currency, he said. It could also be a form of domestic sentiment management, he said, a way to signal to the government's supporters that it will persist and to ordinary Iranians that it could cut a deal with the Trump administration. But Mr. Sabad said it was not clear that Iran's professed openness would lead to any significant diplomatic progress. U.S. demands on Iran's nuclear program have gotten more stringent. I'm skeptical both about the intention behind this outreach, and I'm also skeptical whether there are zones of possible agreements, Mr. Sabad said. Iranian authorities are still recovering from the brief war with Israel in June. The conflict killed top security officials, degraded Iran's military infrastructure, and drained the country's financial resources even further after years of U.S. and European sanctions tied to Iran's nuclear ambitions. I think they're all tired of being beat up by the United States, Mr. Trump said on Air Force One on Sunday, adding that a meeting is being set up, but we may have to act because of what's happening. Experts note that there have been few public signs of defections or divisions among Iran's top leaders. Crowds win when the other side folds, and that is not happening yet, Vali Nasser, a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, said at a Council on Foreign Relations event on Monday. Trump is exploring diplomacy with Iran while weighing strikes, officials say. The Pentagon is presenting a wider range of strike options to the president than previously reported. Targets could include Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missile sites. President Trump is exploring options for diplomacy with Iran, even as he weighs whether to attack the country to try to deter its leaders from killing more protesters, U.S. officials said on Monday. The Pentagon is presenting a wider range of strike options to Mr. Trump than previously reported. Possible targets include Iran's nuclear program, going beyond the U.S. strikes that battered it in June, and ballistic missile sites, a U.S. official said. But the narrower options, a cyber attack or a strike against Iran's domestic security apparatus, which is using lethal force against protesters, are more likely, the official said. Any attack is at least several days away and could prompt a vigorous retaliation from Iran, the official said. Mr. Trump is scheduled to be briefed on options on Tuesday. The White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, said that airstrikes were one of the many options that are on the table, but that diplomacy is always the first option for the president. What you're hearing publicly from the Iranian regime is quite different from the messages the administration is receiving privately, she added, and I think the president has an interest in exploring those messages. That suggested that the private missives the administration has received were less fiery than the Iranian government's bellicose public messages about the United States since Mr. Trump's initial threats of a new attack. Mr. Trump told reporters on Sunday night that it appeared that Iran had crossed his red line after he said this month that he would come to the aid of protesters if the Iranian government used lethal force against them. There seems to be some people killed who weren't supposed to be killed, he said. These are violent. You can call them leaders. I don't know. If they're leaders, I guess they rule with violence. But we're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it, and there's a couple options. On Monday afternoon, Mr. Trump issued a new threat, saying in a social media post that the United States would impose a tariff of 25% on any and all business done with the United States by countries that are engaged in commerce with Iran. It is unclear how or whether this would be enacted. India, Turkey, and Middle Eastern nations could be affected, as well as China, which is the biggest buyer of Iranian oil. But Mr. Trump and China's leader Xi Jinping agreed to a truce last fall in their trade war, and the American president is aimed to keep relations stable in order to ensure a planned April summit with Mr. Xi in Beijing stays on track. The Iranian government has managed to cut internet service across the country, keeping it in an information blackout. Ms. Levitt said Mr. Trump had asked Elon Musk, a conservative billionaire ally in the technology industry, to see if his company, SpaceX, can get internet service to Iranian citizens through the Starlink satellite network. On Monday, Iranian officials appeared to temper some of their anti-American rhetoric of recent days by saying that they were ready to talk with the Trump administration again. We're not looking for war, but we're prepared for war, even more prepared than the previous war. Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, told a conference of foreign ambassadors in the capital, Tehran, broadcast by state television. He appeared to be referring to the 12-day war with Israel in June, during which the United States joined Israel to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. We're also ready for negotiations, but negotiations that are fair, with equal rights and mutual respect, Mr. Araghchi added. Iran also said on Monday that communication channels were open between Mr. Araghchi and Steve Witkoff, a top envoy for Mr. Trump, who led U.S.-Iran talks last spring. Iran has never left the negotiating table, but it will not engage in one-sided negotiations, Ismail Baghai, a foreign ministry spokesman, said at a news conference on Monday. Mr. Witkoff did not respond to a request for comment. Some American officials think that Iran is trying to delay a U.S. attack rather than aiming to sincerely engage in diplomacy, two officials said. It was not clear on what topics the Iranian government was willing to negotiate with the United States. The two nations held talks last spring over Iran's nuclear program, which the country's leaders say is for civilian use. American and Israeli officials, however, fear that it could be used to make nuclear warheads. The Obama administration had negotiated an agreement to limit the program, but Mr. Trump withdrew from the pact in his first term. Iran then increased its uranium enrichment, bringing the material closer to weapons grade, though as of June the country's leaders had not made a decision to pursue nuclear weapons. The talks between the Trump administration and Iran ended with the U.S. strikes on the country's nuclear sites in June. Iranian officials made some overtures after that, but American officials did not engage. Iran's new diplomatic outreach comes at what might be the greatest moment of crisis that the government has faced in years, more so than even during the 12-day war. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and his allies are trying to quell mass protests that have spread across the country. They began in late December over dissatisfaction with the economy and currency crisis, but in reality are the result of years of discontent with the government. The protesters are calling for expansive changes to the government, and while top officials have acknowledged the need to address problems, they are intent on not giving up power. Iranian security forces, armed with tear gas rifles and long guns, have fired into the crowds, and videos of gunfire and people yelling have circulated widely, according to an analysis of the videos by the New York Times. The forces have killed scores of Iranian civilians and injured many more, according to estimates from human rights groups. Iran is dangling talks and deals to dissuade Trump from using military force against them, said Karim Sajapur, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who studies Iran and its foreign policy. It's not clear what they would be offering as concessions, given the destruction of much of their nuclear program and regional proxies. Vali Nasser, a scholar of Iran at Johns Hopkins University, said that the Iranian government was taking a pragmatic approach and not just trying to buy time, but that it had less leverage now in negotiations because its nuclear program has been at a standstill since the June war. Iran's objective is that they don't want any war with the United States, and they want the United States to prevent Israel from attacking Iran, he said. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Israeli officials have been stressing the dangers of Iran's ballistic missile program. But Mr. Nasser said the top commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the major power center in Iran's military, would be reluctant to allow Iranian diplomats to negotiate over that. There is a view in Tehran that Iran's ballistic missiles are the country's most important form of deterrence, he said. Mr. Trump has threatened since January 2nd that he would attack Iran if the government killed protesters. We are locked and loaded and ready to go, he wrote that day in a social media post. It's unclear what, if any, legal justifications under U.S. law and international law that the Trump administration would cite for such an attack. 2 days after ordering the June 21st attack on Iranian nuclear sites, Mr. Trump sent a letter to Congress that said the action was done to advance a vital national interest and to defend an ally, Israel. Mr. Trump was recently briefed by the Pentagon on options for a new strike on Iran. The Times reported on Saturday. The strike could take aim at targets in Tehran, including ones associated with domestic security forces that U.S. officials deem to be responsible for attacks on protesters, including the state-backed Basij militia. A U.S. strike would be aimed at sending a message to the Ayatollah about killing protesters and not intended to lead to a direct overthrow of the government, officials said. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and other aides have been keeping Mr. Trump apprised of the protests, and he has also been tracking news coverage about them. Eli Granamaya, the deputy head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, said in an interview on Friday that there had been signs late in the week that the Iranian government could be having security agencies hold back on unleashing their most repressive actions in order to avoid giving Mr. Trump a rationale to attack. The Islamic Republic of Iran is now facing an unprecedented bottom-up pressure, as well as a top-down pressure, she said. Usually, they've only had to confront one or the other, and they are masters at survival, by the way. However, the security agencies intensified their crackdown over the weekend, leading to what Ms. Granamaya said on Monday was a very bleak turn. The intensifying violence has fueled more vocal threats against Iran from Mr. Trump, even as he has denounced protesters in the United States who criticize his policies. The president has shown he's unafraid to use military options if and when he deems necessary, Ms. Leavitt said on Monday, and nobody knows that better than Iran. The FBI inquiry into ICE shooting is examining victims' possible ties to activist groups. Former department officials warned that such a broad inquiry raised the specter that forms of political protests could be criminalized. Federal investigators assigned to the fatal shooting of a 37-year-old Minneapolis woman are looking into her possible connections to activist groups protesting the Trump administration's aggressive immigration enforcement, in addition to the actions of the federal agent who killed her. People familiar with the situation said, "It seems increasingly unlikely that the agent who fired 3 times at the unarmed woman, Renee Nicole Good, will face any kind of criminal charges, although that could change as investigators collect new evidence," the people added. On Sunday, President Trump described Ms. Good and her wife, Becca Good, as being professional agitators, adding that the authorities would find out who's paying for it. He offered no evidence to support his claims. The decision by the FBI and the Justice Department to scrutinize Ms. Good's activities and her potential connections to local activists is in line with the White House strategy of deflecting blame for the shooting away from federal law enforcement and towards opponents that they have described as domestic terrorists, often without proving any evidence. Justice Department officials under Mr. Trump have long maintained that investigating and punishing protesters who organize efforts to physically obstruct or disrupt immigration enforcement is a legitimate subject of federal inquiries. But casting a broad net over the activist community in Minneapolis, former department officials and critics of the administration said raises the specter that forms of political protest traditionally protected by the First Amendment could be criminalized. Federal officials who have blocked local investigators from reviewing the evidence that they are collecting have said that they are conducting a thorough inquiry that includes an analysis of the actions of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent Jonathan Ross and the physical evidence, including the handgun that he used to kill Ms. Good. Mr. Trump and his advisor Stephen Miller have repeatedly described those protesting the administration's immigration crackdown as a shadowy and violent cabal. In recent months, Trump administration officials have repeatedly vowed to crack down on left-wing activists. They have filed criminal charges against the purported members of what prosecutors described as an Antifa cell in Texas, who fired at immigration officers and activists in California, accusing of plotting to set off homemade bombs outside two companies near Los Angeles on New Year's Eve. But the investigation into protesters in Minneapolis might be different, if only because it has the potential to involve people not accused of committing any violence, or even those without a close connection to Ms. Good. Mr. Trump and many in his administration, particularly Vice President J.D. Vance, have already made clear that they believe that Ms. Good, who was shot at 3 times at close range, was unambiguously responsible for her own death. Speaking to reporters on Sunday, when the inquiry was less than 1 week old, Mr. Trump called Ms. Good very violent and very radical, even though a video analysis by the New York Times suggests that it was likely that she was trying to drive away from officers, not to intentionally harm them. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which has investigated law enforcement officials for killing or injuring citizens in the past, has not even opened an investigation into whether the agent violated Ms. Good's rights under federal law, according to a federal law enforcement official who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. The official added the division was not expected to initiate a case. It is unclear how deeply Ms. Good was involved in activism in Minneapolis beyond participating with her wife in the protest against immigration officers on the day that she was killed. In a group chat used by local residents to monitor ICE movements, her wife was described as a helper in that action. In a statement issued to the Associated Press, Becca Good suggested that the two women took part in some sort of protest on the day of the shooting. On Wednesday, January 7th, we stopped to support our neighbors, she said. We had whistles. They had guns. But even though investigators have not made public a specific allegation that anyone aside from Ms. Good and her wife were involved in an encounter with federal officials that day, the Justice Department is still planning to examine a wide range of activists who took part in the neighborhood watch activities, believing that they were instigators of the shooting, the people familiar with the inquiry said. Complicating matters further, some senior administration officials immediately labeled Ms. Good a domestic terrorist after she was killed, even though investigators barely had time to collect and assess the facts about the case. On Thursday, for example, Mr. Vance said that Ms. Good had interfered with a law enforcement operation, likening her actions to other acts of violence against immigration officers. This is classic terrorism, Mr. Vance said. Over the weekend, Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, echoed Mr. Vance's remarks, asserting that Ms. Good had weaponized her vehicle and that the ICE agent, Mr. Ross, had defended his life. If you look at what the definition of domestic terrorism is, Ms. Noem said, it completely fits the situation on the ground. Experts in domestic terrorism cases said the administration had jumped the gun in lodging accusations like that, and that they failed to follow the traditional procedures for determining whether a case should be classified as domestic terrorism. It's not appropriate for officials to characterize this incident as domestic terrorism before the investigation is complete, said Thomas Brzezowski, the former counsel for domestic terrorism in the Justice Department's National Security Division. There used to be a process, deliberate and considered, to figure out if behavior could be legitimately described as domestic terrorism. And when it's not followed, Mr. Brzezowski said, then the term becomes little more than a political cudgel to bash one's enemies. Mr. Brzezowski raised concerns that the inquiry in Minneapolis was coming a little more than a month after Attorney General Pam Bondi issued a memo that greatly expanded the traditional definition of domestic terrorism. Ms. Bondi's memo classified as domestic terrorism not only recognizably violent crimes like rioting and looting, but also things like impeding law enforcement officers or even simply doxing them. The memo also asserted that domestic terrorists use violence or the threat of violence to advance certain political and social agendas, all of them traditionally associated with left-wing activism. Among the causes listed were opposition to immigration enforcement, anti-capitalism, and hostility towards traditional views on family, religion, and morality. It remains unclear whether the inquiry in Minnesota will include allegations of domestic terrorism, but if it does, Ms. Bondi's memo could give investigators latitude to move beyond the customary practice of focusing such investigations only on people engaged or plotting violence. When you have a memo like this, it complicates things because it builds in a set of assumptions about what domestic terrorism is and what it is not, Mr. Brzezowski said. If you're an investigator in the field, you can't simply run away from this new definition. You have to deal with it. A West Virginia law bars one trans athlete. Her case could affect the country. The Supreme Court on Tuesday will hear a case that could affect laws in 27 states that bar transgender athletes from joining girls' and women's sports teams. Becky Pepper Jackson was 11 years old and a mediocre runner when she sued the state of West Virginia over a law that barred transgender girls like her from joining girls' sports teams. For the next 4 years, Miss Pepper Jackson's status on the school track team was in doubt, and judges blocked the law. And then they unblocked it, and then blocked it again. Now she's 15 years old. She is an accomplished shot putter and discus thrower. A decision about whether she can compete for her final 2 years of high school will now fall to the Supreme Court, which on Tuesday will hear her challenge to the West Virginia law that supporters said was intended to ensure fair competition for female athletes. In an interview, Ms. Pepper Jackson said she was devastated when the law took effect. I want to be able to play on the team with my friends, and that's all I've wanted to do, she said. Miss Pepper Jackson is the only known athlete in West Virginia who would be subject to the law, but her case, in a separate matter from Idaho, dealing with college sports that the court is also hearing on Tuesday, has implications far beyond her personal sports saga. 25 other states have enacted similar restrictions since 2020, amid a backlash to transgender students participating in school sports and transgender rights broadly. However, the Supreme Court rules this year the decision could affect all of those states and the student athletes who seek to play in schools and colleges here. The outcome may also further influence the national conversation about transgender people in American society. President Trump targeted the community in his last presidential campaign and declared at his inauguration that it would be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In February, surrounded by young female athletes in uniform, Mr. Trump signed an executive order directing agencies to withdraw federal funding from schools that allow transgender athletes in girls' and women's sports. The next day, the NCAA, which for years had tried to balance fairness with inclusion in college sports, announced that it would bar trans women from competing in women's sports. The Supreme Court has similarly moved against transgender rights, and seems likely to reject the trans athletes' claims based on recent rulings. After protecting transgender people from workplace discrimination in a 2020 decision written by Justice Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, the court in June upheld a Tennessee law that prohibits certain medical treatments for transgender adolescents. In a case that they heard in October, the justices also seem poised to strike down a Colorado law that bars mental health professionals from seeking to change a minor's gender identity through so-called conversion therapy. Lawyers for West Virginia and Idaho, the Trump administration, and other supporters say that the sports laws are needed, claiming transgender girls and women have a competitive edge. Allowing them to compete on girls' teams, they say, takes away opportunities for female athletes and reverses 5 decades of progress for women in sports since the passage of Title IX, the civil rights law that bars sex discrimination in schools. West Virginia's Attorney General, John McCuskey, whose office is defending the law, said that the restrictions like the one his state adopted in 2021 were not only constitutional but also common sense because men are bigger, faster, and stronger. In an interview, Mr. McCuskey, a father of 2 daughters who play soccer, said, "When you watch your children putting all of this insane and incredible internal effort into being great at something, the idea that their place on one of those teams would be taken by somebody that has a noticeable and obvious unfair advantage does make it personal to me." Efforts to bar transgender athletes from women's sports have seen broad support in the polls. A New York Times poll conducted last year found that nearly 80% of Americans, including 2/3 of Democrats, opposed allowing transgender women to compete in women's sports. The case has attracted the attention of former Olympians, soccer standouts, and NCAA stars, who submitted competing briefs. Some of the athletes urged the court to ensure a level playing field for female athletes by limiting participation to people assigned female at birth. Others said the justices should not prevent trans girls and women from experiencing the benefits of being part of a team. The Idaho law was challenged by Lindsay Hickox, a college student who tried out for the women's track and cross-country teams and played club soccer. Challenges to both states' laws argue that the restrictions violate the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection, which requires the government to have valid reasons for treating people differently. 2 appeals courts have sided with the students and blocked enforcement of the laws. A wrinkle in the Idaho case came when Ms. Hickox, who's now 24 and a senior at Boise State University, moved to withdraw her suit in September, saying she would refrain from playing school-sponsored women's sports. Ms. Hickox, who received testosterone suppression and estrogen treatment, cited negative public scrutiny that would distract from her academics and her plans to graduate in May. In response, the justices said that they would defer a decision about whether to dismiss her case as moot until after Tuesday's argument. In West Virginia, Ms. Pepper Jackson, who was assigned male at birth, transitioned in 3rd grade. She has legally changed her name, and her birth certificate recognizes her as female. She says that because she takes puberty-blocking medication, she has not gone through typical male puberty and does not have the muscle mass, bone density, or hormone levels of boys. In an interview, Ms. Pepper Jackson said that she was inspired by her 2 older brothers to join the middle school cross-country team and was crushed when West Virginia's governor signed the law a few months before trials. With the help of the American Civil Liberties Union and Lambda Legal, she and her mother, Heather Jackson, filed a lawsuit, saying that the ban violated Title IX protections against sex discrimination in schools and the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Guarantee. Among the questions for the justices on Tuesday is whether the word sex under Title IX means only biological sex or includes gender identity. Miss Pepper Jackson's improvement on the field has made her legal case more challenging, as opponents have argued that she has taken opportunities from other girls. After a lackluster cross-country performance in sixth grade, in which, according to her court filings, she regularly finished near the back of the pack, Miss Pepper Jackson said that her coach recommended that she instead try throwing the shot put and discus. Her mother created a practice pit in the backyard, mapping out the precise measurements in the space where an above-ground pool once stood. Miss Pepper Jackson said that she stayed late for double practice sessions at school and lifted weights all summer. She carried a broomstick behind her neck to work on keeping her arms up and back straight. As a freshman at Bridgeport High School, she qualified for the state tournament last May and placed 8th in shot put and 3rd in discus. West Virginia's lawyers, citing state athletic statistics, said in just one season she beat out and displaced nearly 400 female competitors. In response, Ms. Pepper Jackson said that she recognized that there were a limited number of spots for athletes in the championships, but she put in the work to earn one. I don't think they're understanding how much effort I am truly putting in behind the scenes, she said in a Zoom interview with her mother and 2 rambunctious Great Danes in the background. I don't think that they care. A teammate who initially beat Miss Pepper Jackson in throwing competitions later objected to her participation after Miss Pepper Jackson outperformed her. In filing at the Supreme Court, Adelia Cross, who's 17, said she was angry and discouraged that Miss Pepper Jackson had taken her spot in a 2023 competition. Miss Cross said she was initially reluctant to speak out for fear that she would be labeled transphobic, but decided to do so in part because she alleged that Miss Pepper Jackson had made vulgar remarks in the middle school locker room, making her feel embarrassed and fearful. The Supreme Court, like all appellate courts, is not supposed to consider facts and allegations like Miss Cross's that were not part of the record in the lower courts. Miss Cross and her family declined to be interviewed, but have shared their stories on a website maintained by her lawyers. They were represented by the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Christian conservative legal organization that is also assisting the attorneys general from Idaho and West Virginia. The middle school investigated Miss Cross' complaint in 2023 and concluded that the allegations could not be substantiated, according to a letter from the school system's lawyer reviewed by the New York Times. Miss Pepper Jackson denied the allegations as well. I was not raised like that, she said. Miss Pepper Jackson's case first reached the Supreme Court on an emergency basis in 2023. The justices at that time issued a brief order allowing her to compete while litigation continued. The order gave no reasons. Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito Jr. dissented. In April, a divided panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit said that the law could not be enforced against Miss Pepper Jackson. The majority found that the law discriminated in violation of Title IX by preventing trans girls, but not trans boys, from participating on teams consistent with their gender identity, and did so regardless of whether any given girl possesses any inherent athletic advantages based on being transgender. Given that Miss Pepper Jackson had not gone through male puberty, allowing her to play on a boys' team would require her to share the field with boys who are larger, stronger, and faster than her because of the elevated levels of circulating testosterone she lacks, wrote Judge Toby Haytens, joined by Judge Pamela Harris. In dissent, Judge Stephen Agee said that Miss Pepper Jackson's participation had taken opportunities from girls who were born female, precisely what West Virginia's law was intended to prevent. Allowing transgender girls, regardless of any advantage, as participants in biological girls' sports turns Title IX on its head and reverses the monumental work that Title IX has done to promote girls' sports from its inception, he wrote. Throughout the litigation, West Virginia's lawyers have said that Ms. Pepper Jackson could instead compete on the boys' track and field team, but she insists that is not an option. Her reasoning? I'm not a man. The Fed changes course and takes on Trump's political fight. The Justice Department's decision to open up a criminal investigation of Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, is a major escalation in the pressure campaign against the central bank to cut interest rates. Jerome Powell wanted to avoid a fight. That had long been his approach to handling President Trump and his relentless attacks on the Federal Reserve, which in his second term had taken on heightened intensity. Between an executive order wresting more control over the Fed's oversight of Wall Street to Mr. Trump's attempt to oust a sitting member of the Policy Setting Board of Governors, the Fed had stuck to a time-tested strategy: avoid provoking the president. At times, that meant bending to meet his demands in areas like climate change and bank regulation. But Mr. Powell, the Fed chair, drew the line when it came to protecting the central bank's autonomy to set interest rates. A criminal investigation into whether Mr. Powell lied to Congress, revealed by the New York Times on Sunday, has prompted the central bank to jettison its cautious approach and fight. The battle's outcome could determine whether the Fed remains an independent entity. Trump is now exercising the nuclear option, so there's no longer a reason for Powell not to speak his mind, said Maurice Obstfeld, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, who was formerly the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Powell's decision to push back, which came in a rare video message on Sunday evening, tees up the most challenging moment in his roughly 8 years at the helm of the central bank. Mr. Powell, whose term as chair ends in May, must now decide how hard to continue fighting and whether to remain in his role as a governor, a term that is set to expire in 2028. Mr. Powell and staff members at the Fed worked through the weekend after the Justice Department served the central bank with grand jury subpoenas late on Friday. What culminated was a 2-minute video released Sunday evening featuring Mr. Powell bluntly calling out the administration for seeking to leverage a criminal investigation into costs related to the Fed's renovation of its headquarters as pretext to coerce the central bank into lowering borrowing costs. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings, Mr. Powell said on Sunday. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. The Fed has cut interest rates only gradually, reducing them by 0.75 percentage points in September to a new range of 3.5% to 3.75%. But Mr. Trump has demanded rates as low as 1%, calling Mr. Powell a numbskull and a stubborn mule for refusing to concede. Friday's subpoenas relate to renovations that have been taking place since 2022 at the Fed's headquarters in Washington. The sprawling project, which is set to be completed in 2027, is $700 million over budget and is expected to cost roughly $2.5 billion. Mr. Trump seized on the renovations as a new line of attack against the central bank this summer, accusing Mr. Powell of mismanagement and taking the rare step of showing up at the construction site for a tour. Legal experts saw it as the potential groundwork to try to remove the Fed chair for cause, the only justification that a president can use to lawfully fire an official at the central bank. Cause has typically meant gross malfeasance or a dereliction of duty while in office, although it has never been tested. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mr. Powell's decision to respond directly by video reflected the explosive nature of the Justice Department's move. Never before has a Fed chair faced a criminal investigation. It also represented a stark departure from the administration's attacks on Mr. Powell to date, which had typically taken the form of personal insults from Mr. Trump. The president, who nominated Mr. Powell to the job during his first term, had also threatened to fire the Fed's chair, but had not acted on it. Still, Mr. Powell had preemptively retained outside counsel, hiring Williams & Connolly, a top litigation firm in Washington. Mr. Trump instead tried to oust Lisa D. Cook, whom the Biden administration had appointed to the Fed. The president, citing allegations of mortgage fraud, said that he had cause to remove her. Arguments for the case will be heard by the Supreme Court on January 21st. Mr. Powell, a lawyer by training and close advisors, saw that the Justice Department's investigation as a sharp escalation in the administration's affront against the institution that required a forceful response. Mr. Trump denied having knowledge of the U.S. Attorney's investigation, saying on Sunday that he did not know anything about it. But he's certainly not very good at the Fed, and he's not very good at building buildings, referring to Mr. Powell. In the past, Mr. Powell had demurred from commenting directly on the president's attacks. Instead, he spoke in favor of the importance of the Fed maintaining its long-standing independence, a protection that Congress granted the central bank so that officials set rates with an aim to attain low, stable inflation and a healthy labor market, rather than to the benefit of whoever is in the White House. But that changed on Sunday. He didn't mince words, said Kenneth Rogoff, a professor of economics at Harvard and a former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He's tended to turn the other cheek, and he's reached a moment where he can't. The Fed seems to recognize that this administration rarely stops pressuring people and organizations to get what it wants. So anyone who won't capitulate to that pressure ultimately needs to fight back, added Douglas Elmendorf, a former director of the Congressional Budget Office who teaches at Harvard. Mr. Powell on Monday got the backing of every living former chair of the Fed, as well as multiple former Treasury secretaries who called out what they described as prosecutorial attacks to undermine that independence. This is how monetary policy is made in emerging markets with weak institutions, with highly negative consequences for inflation and the functioning of their economies more broadly, they wrote in a joint statement. Janet Yellen, who served as Fed chair from 2014 and 2018 and was among the statement's signatories, said in an interview that the investigation constituted the most significant attack ever on the central bank's independence. The fact that he's willing to go that far to intimidate a federal official suggests he's going to stop at nothing to get his way with respect to Fed policy, she said. If you can bring charges for no reason whatsoever against your enemies, we're no longer living in a society governed by the rule of law. She added, that's the end of Fed independence. The guardrails protecting the Fed's independence were crafted by Congress to avoid a president having undue influence over major policy decisions that had significant sway over the trajectory of the economy. One of the foremost protections revolves around the 7 members of the powerful Board of Governors. Those officials are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but they cannot be fired at will. They also serve staggered 14-year terms. Rate decisions are voted on by a 12-person committee made up of the members, the board, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and a rotating set of 4 presidents from the 12 regional banks. If Mr. Powell opts to stay on as a governor, something he has declined to publicly comment on, that would deny Mr. Trump the opportunity to appoint another member to the board. It's harder for him to go now, Scott Alvarez, the Fed's former general counsel, said of Mr. Powell. If he goes now, it's under a cloud. If they hadn't done anything, he might have just left. The president gained an unexpected vacancy in August when Adriana Kugler abruptly stepped down as governor after repeatedly violating the central bank's trading rules. He tapped for the job one of his top economic advisors, Stephen Moran, who took only a temporary leave of absence from the White House. Mr. Trump is also in the final stages of selecting Mr. Powell's replacement for chair. Kevin Hassett, the director of White House National Economic Council, is a top contender. Appearing Monday on CNBC, Mr. Hassett said that he had not been involved in the Justice Department's decision to investigate the Federal Reserve. He said that he had not been briefed on the matter and that he would expect the president had not been as well. Pressed repeatedly during the interview on the extent to which the president hoped to use the investigation to pressure the Fed to lower interest rates, Mr. Hassett at one point told CNBC, "In the fullness of time, we'll find out whether it looks like a pretext." Asked on Monday about the investigation, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, took the opportunity to criticize Mr. Powell. "I do know one thing for sure. Jerome Powell is not very good at his job," she said in an interview with Fox News. "As to whether he's a criminal, that's an answer the Department of Justice is going to have to find." In a sign that the investigation could have an impact on the Senate confirmation process, Senator Thom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina and a member of the Banking Committee, on Sunday vowed to oppose any nominee for the Fed, including any coming chair vacancy, citing reports of subpoenas. The investigation will also have broad implications for Ms. Cook's case. The Supreme Court will be ruling on how much latitude a president has to remove a federal official and the extent to which they can define what constitutes cause. I hope that the Supreme Court is watching because it would eviscerate the independence of the Federal Reserve if the president could remove somebody on an allegation rather than on finding of criminal behavior, Mr. Alvarez said. The fact that the DOJ has alleged this doesn't make it true. Catherine Judge, a professor of Columbia Law School, added that the Federal Reserve will not remain independent if the president feels entitled to use every tool at his disposal to harass and intimidate Fed officials. Hesse Levinson's Taft, Jewish baby on the cover of Nazi magazine, dies at 91. Without her parents' knowledge, her portrait was entered as a prank in a contest in 1935 to represent the ideal Aryan infant, and she won. Hesse Levinson's Taft, who was an infant, appeared on the cover of a Nazi magazine in Germany, promoting her as the ideal Aryan baby, a distinction complicated by the fact that she was Jewish and had been exploited as part of a dangerous hoax. Died on January 1st at her home in San Francisco. She was 91. Her death was confirmed by her family. Terrifying at first, the story eventually became a source of pride for Mrs. Taft and her parents for the way that it neatly illustrated the absurd pseudoscience underlying Adolf Hitler's racial ideology. "I feel a sense of revenge," she said much later. "Good revenge." The episode began in 1934 when she was 6 months old and her parents, Latvian opera singers living in Berlin, hired the well-known photographer Hans Behlen to take her portrait. After framing the portrait, her parents displayed it on their piano. One day, the woman who cleaned their home noticed it and told Hesse's mother that she had seen her daughter on the cover of a magazine. "My mother thought surely she must be mistaken, that there are many babies that look alike, and just told her, well, that couldn't be the case." Mrs. Taft said in an interview with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1990. The woman insisted that it was the same baby. "Just give me some money," she said, "and I'll get you the magazine." Soon she returned with a copy of Son im Haus, or Son in the Home, one of several pro-Nazi magazines that were allowed to circulate in the country after Hitler had shut down thousands of other publications, and there on the cover was the portrait from the piano. Hesse's mother flipped through the pages. On the inside of the magazine were pictures of the army with men wearing swastikas. Mrs. Taft told the Holocaust Museum, "My parents were horrified." Her mother went to Mr. Balin's studio and showed him the magazine. "What is this?" she said. "How did this happen?" He told her that the Nazis had invited him to submit photos for a contest to find a baby representing the epitome of the Aryan race, and Hesse was among those he included in his submission. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, chose the winner. "But you knew that this is a Jewish child," Hesse's mother told the photographer. He replied, "I wanted to allow myself the pleasure of this joke." And then he added, "You see, I was right. Of all the babies, they picked this baby as the perfect Aryan." Suddenly the photo was everywhere, in advertisements for baby clothes, on postcards, hanging in people's homes. My parents were both shocked by the possible consequences that this could bring and amazed at the irony of it all, Mrs. Taft said. As Latvians, her parents were protected from laws targeting Jews of German descent. Still, they were terrified that the Nazis would discover what had happened and execute them. So they kept Hesse inside, rarely taking her out, even for walks. In 1937, as Hitler tightened his grip on Germany, the family moved back to Latvia, fearing the Nazis or their sympathizers would seek retribution if they learned the truth about the photo, so they resolved to keep what had happened a secret. As her parents advanced in age, Mrs. Taft finally revealed the harrowing tale in the 1987 book Muted Voices, Jewish Survivors of Latvia Remember, an essay collection edited by the Holocaust survivor and historian Gertrude Snyder. It is the story of a Jewish baby selected by loyal Nazis to serve as an archetypical example of the Aryan race, the theory which the Nazis' leadership seized every opportunity to promote, Mrs. Taft wrote. I was that baby. Hesse Lewinson was born on May 17, 1934, in Berlin. Her father was a baritone opera singer. Her mother sang soprano. After marrying in Latvia, her parents moved to Germany in 1928 to pursue careers in the opera, but their Jewish-sounding surname made finding work very difficult. So, for guidance, they visited the Latvian consulate in Berlin. The consul assured my parents that Hitler would not last. He advised them to stay in Berlin until Hitler fell, and then they could resume their singing careers. Her father got a job representing a Latvian company in Berlin and became successful enough that the family could afford a nice apartment in Augsburger Strasse, a prestigious street in the city. But things were very, very tenuous. They finally left Berlin, returning briefly to Latvia before settling in Paris. When the Nazis occupied that city in 1940, they fled again, first to Nice and then to Cuba, where Hesse attended a British school. In 1949, they moved to New York City. She received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Barnard College in 1955 and a master's from Columbia University in 1958. The following year, she married Earl Taft. He died in 2021. For more than 30 years, Mrs. Taft worked for the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey, overseeing advanced placement chemistry exams for high school students. She is survived by her children, Nina and Alex Taft, 4 grandchildren, and a sister, Naomi Pollock. I can laugh about it now, she told Tablet Magazine in 2022, but if the Nazis had known who I really was, I wouldn't be alive. In fact, she said she was grateful to the photographer. I thank him for having the courage to do that as a non-Jew, to challenge his own government, she told Reuters. It was an irony that needed to be exposed. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 13th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Jeff Shapiro. Thank you for listening.